Hey, is this different? Guy sitting down, not doing any work. In other videos, you'll probably hear me, if you haven't heard me already, say the thinking part is the hard part. Well, today what we're going to do is talk a little bit about the material that you're going to choose to use. If you were a first-year student in this wood shop and you made a footstool, chances are you made that out of pine. If you look at a piece of pine, you were given that and told to make your project out of that for several reasons. It wasn't just by, I guess, process of elimination. The reason why you used pine was because when you looked around, everybody else in your class was making that project out of pine. And there were probably a lot of first-year students who were also making that project. So when you think about 50 or 60 kids making the same project, we have to keep in mind cost of the material. Well, pine happens to be a relatively good material to use for a first-year student. It's soft. If we take a walk outside, which we probably will later, we'll take a look at some hardwoods and we'll look at some softwoods. When you think about softwoods, you're talking about a rapid growing material that's easily machinable because it's not as dense as the harder materials or wood that takes longer to grow. Pine is a rapid grower. It is a softwood. It's a conifer, which means that the fruit of that tree is the cones. When you look at any tree that is green all year round, with the exception of one, the larch drops all of its needles in the fall, just like a deciduous tree. But if you go out and it's December and you see a tree that's green, chances are in this area, that tree is a conifer. It's a softwood. And that's how we classify material in the shop. It's either a conifer, a softwood, or it's a deciduous tree, a hardwood. Now there's some hardwoods that are actually softer than some pines, and some coniferous trees or softwoods that are harder than some of our hardwoods. So it doesn't really have to do with the density of the material. If I could take my fingernail, make a mark in that, it doesn't really have to do with that. Woods are classified by the way they grow. They're either deciduous trees, they have broad leaves, they lose their leaves in the fall, or they're softwoods and they will have needles, and for the most part, have needles on the trees all year round. Let's take a look at pine, the material that is not labeled here because it's pretty obvious. Pine comes to us from the sawmill, actually from the distributor. In our case, it's Jaeger lumber. Pine comes to us already machined. When you look at a piece of pine, if I buy 5 pieces of pine, they will all stack up absolutely perfectly evenly together. You should know that all boards have 3 parts. They have surfaces, they have edges, and they have ends. On a piece of pine, the edges come to us already machined, and they're sold to us in certain widths. In other words, I could buy a board that's an inch thick, 12 inches wide. I could buy one an inch thick, 10 inches wide. I could buy one an inch thick, 8 inches wide, an inch 6. I could buy an inch 4. And when you think about it, they're all kind of even numbers. But when we look at the material that I say was 1 inch thick, 12 inches wide, it doesn't really measure up to that. A certain amount of this material is taken off because they're all smooth. The surfaces are smooth, the edges are smooth. So on a piece of pine, if you go to the lumber store and you get a 1x12 board of pine, it's not going to come out to be 1 inch thick. It's going to be 3/4 of an inch because wood is sold to them in the rough. It's from the sawmill and then it's dressed down or it's cleaned up, which gives me this nice even surface. We'll take a walk over to the hardwood rack and you'll notice the difference. These edges are machined too. When you look at this, this comes to us already true. So a piece of pine, a softwood, that's supposed to be 1 inch thick, 12 inches wide, is really 3/4 of an inch thick, and it's really 11 1/4 inches wide. They take off a certain amount of material because they machine it. When you think of this softwood, This is sold different than the hardwoods that we have in the shop. And we'll get into that a little bit. If you go to Home Depot, if you go to Lowe's, and you're getting a 2x4, I want to go there and I want to buy a piece of wood 2 inches thick, 4 inches wide. You're not going to buy a 2x4 that's sold that measurement, because a 2x4 is really only 1.5 inches thick and it's only 3.5 inches wide. Why? Because every 2x4, you could take your hand, rub it across there, it's nice and smooth and even. It has been machined. So they will sell you a material that's not really 2 inches thick, 4 inches wide. It's really 1.5 inches by 3.5 because they've machined it. You could take a 2x4 and it'll feel smooth as can be, as every 2x4, 2x6, 2x8, they are never that size because a certain amount of material is taken off because it's surfaced down. It's milled for you that way. So it's important that you understand the difference between this board of pine and all of these other materials. The other materials that we're going to talk about, most of them are hardwood, but one of them isn't. A material that we got into not too long ago, which is cypress. Cypress is sold to us similar to pine, but not exactly the same way pine is sold to us. This piece of cypress I can get as a 6-inch wide board, an 8-inch wide board, a 4-inch wide board, but it comes to us in the rough with the edges. But the thing that's kind of cool about cypress is this grain. The grain pattern in cypress is very ribbony. If you look at it, it's very pronounced. Cypress is great if you want to make a material or a project that you're going to put outside. Cypress is a softwood. So when you look at our two softwoods that we work with in here, I have pine, I have cypress as the softwoods. Cypress is the type of material where I get, and it has not been surfaced down. In other words, when we get it into the shop door, it's 1 inch thick. Reason for that is if I get the surface down to a certain measurement, it dries out uneven and it tends to warp, twist, and bow. So cypress, again, a softwood with pine. Now we'll talk about our hardwoods. And this is where you guys have to make a decision. By the way, cypress stains really cool. If you stain it dark, it's going to be the type of material that will really show almost like candle flames. Certain areas of cypress will stain darker than others. So cypress, and again, is one of those materials that stain very well like pine. Other thing with pine, knots. You'll always have knots in pine. You'll always have machined edges. I'm not saying that you won't have knots in hardwoods, but there'll be a lot more knots in a piece of pine than you'll find in hardwoods. And before I wrap this up and go over to the hardwoods, when you look at pine, cypress, they stain very well, they finish very well. The downside of both is if I take something and I drop it on it, it's usually going to leave a mark or a dent. A lot of older pieces of pine, you'll notice, get weathered because people will kind of hit them, bang them, ding them, and there'll be marks left in pieces of pine. A lot of people call that antiquing. Most people will call that, oops, just I made a mistake and I dropped something on it. But these are our softwoods. Let's go to our hardwoods. We're going to take a look at the hardwoods that are kind of soft first. Poplar, and I was shocked when I learned that most hardwoods that are sold in this area, out of all of them, this is the most popular. Poplar being popular. Why? Well, poplar is the type of material, it's a hardwood, so it's not going to have a lot of knots. We're going to go in the woods, we'll take a look at some poplar trees, and you'll notice how you're not going to see a whole lot of branches come out of that poplar tree. Poplar has a greenish tint. It can also have a whitish tint. It can also have a grayish tint. It can also have a blackish tint. It is soft. If I take my fingernail and push it in here, it will actually dent on that surface. Poplar is sold just like hardwoods as the tree runs. So there's no standard when we buy a piece of poplar. Poplar can come to us 6 inches wide, come to us 7 inches. 6 1/4, 7 1/2, 10 inches, 10 1/4. There's no standard in the width of a piece of poplar. Poplar is referred to as a paint grade material. So if I wanted to get a piece of wood and I want to paint it, I want to choose this because it's relatively inexpensive. There's no knots in it which will bleed when I paint like a piece of pine. And poplar is the type of material you could sand it up. It finishes well if you're going to paint it. If you want to leave it the natural color, you're going to get all different hues. You'll get some greens, some grays, some blacks, some whites. So when you look at poplar, it's one of those materials, if you want to use it as a structural material where you never see it, but you want it to be a piece of hardwood, poplar is your boy. So if you're going to paint it, poplar is popular. When you look at the cost of poplar, poplar costs us around $1.85 to $2 a foot. Pine costs about $1.50 a foot. So pine is cheaper than poplar. Poplar has the advantage of not having knots. When I look at poplar, that could be a choice if I wanted to upgrade over a piece of pine. Let's go to another material that we use most in the shop. Red oak tends to be, because it's grown locally, tends to be a great alternative if you want to use a really hard wood. When you look at a piece of red oak, the thing that's distinctive about it is the grain. It's very similar to the grain on cypress, but it's very porous. So if I wanted to choose a piece of hardwood and I want to stain it, red oak stains really well. Red oak is heavy, it's dense. It's one of those materials that if you want a hardwood piece, this is going to be your hardwood boy. It's relatively inexpensive. So if we go pine, poplar, the next cost up is going to be a piece of oak. Usually between $2.50 and $2.25 and $2.60 is about the range of a piece of red oak. So it's more expensive than poplar, but it's the type of material, if you wanted to use as by itself, I could finish this and just polyurethane it, it works well. If I want to stain it, a hardwood that stains really well, red oak is the choice. It's relatively inexpensive, and it's the type of material around this area is the most popular if you want to choose a piece of hardwood. Red oak has a reddish hue to it, but it also can be creamy color. It can also have a golden look to it. So what you get with red oak definitely varies. So I have red oak as a choice. If I want to move up to a different type of material that's going to stay white, this is what everybody is after, a nice piece of ash. The reason why I mention ash is because ash has the grain of red oak, but it has the white color of a piece of maple. It's kind of a blend between maple and red oak. Ash does not stain very well. Red oak does stain well. Ash is going to cost you about $3, $3.25 a board foot, so it's more expensive again than red oak. Ash is the type of material that if I choose this, I'm choosing it just because I want the material to stay white. So, and the other thing that's cool, I can use other darker woods, combine it with this ash, and I have a nice contrast. I could take a piece of walnut, put it up against a piece of ash, and I have a great contrast. The other popular wood that we have as an accent wood in our shop is a piece of purple heart. And if I pull down this piece of purple heart, ash is often popular with purple heart because you have that contrast. I don't like ash to stain. I want to polyurethane this. You can oil this, but I like to polyurethane it and seal it. It has, again, a greater cost than red oak, but it's one of those woods where if you want it to stay white, that's the boy for you. Let's move on to maple because we're talking about colors. Maple is our white wood. It does not stain very well because it's our hardest wood. It's the densest wood. It doesn't have an open grain to it. If you put a stain on a piece of maple, and you wipe it off 10 minutes later, you're gonna probably get most of the color of maple and very little color of the stain. Maple is hard, super hard, a dense grower, will stay white. It's also one of those materials that I never want to choose if I don't want to see white, because this material right here will stay exactly the way it is. It's heavy. It's one of those materials where when I'm making a cutting board, this is the guy I want to choose. Maple is a very dense material, very heavy. Cost is between $3.50 and $4 a foot. So again, a price up from ash and a price up from oak, a price up from poplar. But if you want the white color and you're gonna make a cutting board or something that's gonna get abused, maple is your boy. Let's go into some of the more personal woods. We'll talk about walnut. Walnut is a really dark material, but the darkness definitely does matter and vary. When you look at it, some people can look at a piece of walnut and say, hey, I want that because it's super dark. They could flip it over to the other side and there could be white in this. When you look at materials, you have to take into account something that's called springwood and heartwood. Springwood is the type of material that grows on the outside of the tree. On pieces like walnut, pieces like cherry, you will see springwood is literally white. When it gets old enough and matures, it will always turn if the tree is left to grow. So you'll have the outside area as being white or light. And you could see this on the piece of cherry. You notice how this is more orangey and more red or cream or on the darker side. And on the very same piece, you have a piece of white area over here. Walnut, I would never buy it, use it, and stain it. That's the dumbest thing you can do. You don't want to be labeled a jackass in here. What you see is what you get with walnut. So if I choose that color, that's what I'm going to get. Walnut's a great accent for cutting boards. Also, if I want something that's super dark, machines really well. Most walnut is really not that hard. It's a softer hardwood. It finishes really, really well. It's one of those materials, though, you have to really sand. If you sand it well, it will definitely finish. Cost, I have now seen walnut range between $5 and $7 a foot. It does fluctuate. We have seen wood cost come down. I've seen it as low as $3.50, but usually walnut is definitely one of the more expensive woods that you're gonna buy. Cherry is one of my all-time favorites. Cherry has that reddish kind of orange hue. It's very expensive. It's very popular in kitchen cabinets now. Cherry costs between $5 and $7 a board foot, so it's one of the most expensive woods, but it finishes really well. When you look at cherry, it's another one that you never want to stain. If you stain this material, I'll laugh at you, and then I'll point. When you look at it, it's definitely personable. It's one of those woods that you would put in the bedroom area because it's warm, it's loving, it's caring. Cherry is forgiving. It will also darken with age. I'm not a fan of staining cherry. I know people stain them for kitchen cabinets, but to me, what you see is what you get again with cherry. Cherry, walnut, maple, ash, red oak, poplar, cypress, and of course our softwoods pine. Purple heart, I do have material that we will use as an accent. This is purple heart. Some people use it with cherry, but with maple and ash and red oak, it's one of those materials that really combines to provide a nice contrast. The next time I see you, we're gonna take a walk outside in the woods. I wanted to go over this so you can make an informed decision of the material that you want to choose for your next project. And again, after your footstool, the first project that you make, this is all going to be up to you. So, do I want something that's relatively inexpensive that I could use, that I could paint? Do I want just an inexpensive hardwood? Do I want to use a material that I'm going to use for an outside project? Am I concerned about cost? By the way, pine stains really well. It's one of those materials you can look at and say, wow, it really finished well. So you have to make those decisions. It's the expensive end or on the cheaper side. And cost does matter. I'll see you outside when we take a walk in the woods and we'll look at these trees. Have a great day.